We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Jim Meigs. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributor to the City Journal, and previous editor of 4 magazines, including most recently Popular Mechanics. He's also the host of the How Do We Fix It podcast. Thanks for joining me today, Jim.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So, Jim, as I understand it, you weren't always a fan of nuclear power. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how your opinion has changed over the years.
I grew up in the era of the kind of early passionate environmental movement. So when I was in college, I was definitely part of the protests against building new nuclear power plants. I bought into the idea that the risks of nuclear power were too much. You know, I remember the 3 Mile Island accident and Chernobyl, and those had a big impact on me. But as I learned more about how our energy grid works, and as I also learned more about what a serious problem putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere really is, I realized there just aren't that many solutions to reducing our carbon output without also kind of putting a stranglehold on our economy. Wind and solar are great and they have a place, but they are too difficult to use as the foundation of our power grid, simply because of the intermittency. Everybody recognizes it, but people don't really, I think, often grapple with just how hard it is to have a power system where your main sources of power just come and go unpredictably. Sometimes you have way too much, sometimes you don't have enough. Nuclear, on the other hand, gives you steady, reliable power 24/7 for months on end. And that is something that we need, despite a lot of what I think is wishful thinking about some future power grid that will be highly flexible and will move the power around over thousands of miles, you know, from where the wind's blowing to where it's not blowing and everything else. All that's feasible someday with trillions of dollars spent, but we need good, reliable power right now. And nuclear is, I think, our best solution.
And of course, you know, you and I were speaking a little bit before we hit record. And really, I think we need to be able to analyze a lot of these problems dispassionately, use let's say, hopefully the objectivity of science to be able to understand all of these problems and their solutions a little bit better. So if you could tell us a little bit about the Manhattan Institute and how you guys are working to analyze some of these issues as well.
The Manhattan Institute is a really cool organization that I'm proud to be part of. It brings together a lot of scholars, journalists, researchers to look into a whole range of problems. And typically it looks for solutions that are compatible with free markets. They're compatible with maximum individual freedom, business freedom, and not relying on heavy-handed government interventions. Not to say that we don't see a role for government in many different issues, but often, if you look at a problem, and the energy issue is a great example, there are good solutions that are based on market forces. In fact, the market forces are often the best way to solve these problems. Whereas if you put the idea of what should be the mix of our energy grid, what kind of technologies should we use, if you leave that up to some government agencies, the odds that they're going to pick the best technologies are actually really slim. If you look at history, our governments and all governments around the world have had a really bad record of figuring out, you know, rapidly evolving technologies, what to support, how to choose. The market does a much better job of this. And I think we need rapid progress in clean, zero carbon energy, but it also needs to be energy that can reach the consumer when they need it, not something that kind of comes and goes with the weather.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's jump into some more specific examples that we're currently seeing around the world. So the current energy shortage in Europe could be catastrophic for their industry and their population this winter especially. So how has this really been a much longer road to get to the current energy woes that they have, rather than just blaming this on the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Yeah, Europe was in trouble with its energy supply long before Russia invaded Ukraine. Germany especially has been seen itself as the world's climate pioneer. And starting more than 20 years ago, they began a campaign they call Energiewende to wean themselves off of coal and gas and oil and rely heavily on wind and solar power for their electricity. They've invested over 500 billion euros into this, a massive investment, and it just hasn't worked very well. And even before the invasion, they were having trouble sometimes in the winter. If you'd have a couple of weeks when the wind didn't really blow, they would be in near crisis. As a result, they really didn't get off coal to the degree that they had planned. They still have massive coal mines in operation. They import a ton of coal. Their carbon emissions came down, but not really that fast, no faster than in the US, where we haven't been as aggressive on these policies. And they spent a fortune. Their people in Germany pay, I think the latest figure is about 3 times, or before the war, about 3 times what consumers in most other countries pay for electricity. So all of that's a huge drag on the economy with a relatively minimal benefit for the environment. Then they made themselves also vulnerable to Russia, because as they tried to cut down on their domestic production, they were importing more and more natural gas and other types of energy from Russia. So what's true for Germany is true for most of the rest of Europe as well, sometimes not to the same degree. Now they're facing, as you say, a really catastrophic situation this winter, where literally there could be homes simply not heated, major industries shutting down their factories, an economic collapse. This is a devastating position that they have put themselves in through their deliberate policies of trying to base their entire energy system on 2 sources, wind and solar, that just aren't up to the challenge of powering a modern economy.
So, Jim, I know you talk about the way that a carbon tax could actually help the market in finding some efficiency. So how would this work, and what does that look like to you?
Yeah, a carbon tax is really controversial. It's funny, all the economists, all the academic economists, a lot of people in think tanks, we all love this idea of a carbon tax, or many people do. The public doesn't really love it, and I'm not terribly optimistic we're going to get to a carbon tax. But let's imagine that we could pull this off. There's a great, well thought out plan. It's a carbon tax and dividend, basically, where we levy a tax on the carbon output of any kind of product, whether it's made domestic or, importantly, whether it's imported. And that tax is paid and built into the price of the product you buy, whether it's a plane ticket or a new toaster or anything else. Well, this sounds like it's going to raise prices on consumers dramatically, but then you balance that out with a rebate that's paid to all American consumers. And according to kind of a standard version of this plan, initially people would get about $2,000 a year. So if for people in middle to lower incomes, that would more than make up for the extra money they're spending on gas or products and stuff. For the very affluent, who tend to have carbon footprints that are a huge multiple of the average, they would pay more. So it would be kind of a progressive tax on the rich to help us bring down our carbon emissions. In theory, you could do all this without really disrupting the economy long term. There would be a lot of short-term disruptions. I mean, some people would come on the wrong side of that line. If you live in a rural area and you drive a pickup 50 miles back and forth to work every day, you might find yourself in a less desirable position. So there are a lot of things to figure out and a lot of things to clean up. I'm not that optimistic that a full-scale carbon tax could be implemented. And to be honest, there are good arguments against it. I would love to sit down with some critics and kind of hash that out. But I think that some method of letting the market sort out, the notion here is, if you're taxing the carbon, then anybody who can make that toaster in a lower with releasing less carbon in the process, then that toaster is cheaper. That's the toaster that's going to be most popular in the market. And so you're incentivizing ways to make all sorts of industries more efficient and giving consumers a huge incentive to not out of the goodness of their hearts, but just because they want to pay less for things, a huge incentive to seek out these more efficient products, whether it's a car or, or how you build your house or almost anything in your life. So that's the advantage. You're letting the market solve these problems instead of having the government step in and say, we're going to mandate this technology or that technology. Right now, the policy that we're seeing from the Biden administration is to pick and choose a few technologies, wind and solar in particular, heat pumps for houses, which are good. I mean, I would pick these two if I was king of the world, but we don't know which technologies are going to work out best in the long run. I'm leery of having the government step in and identify certain technologies, spend a ton of money on them, ask consumers to spend a ton of money on them, and expect that to solve the problem. It might help the problem, but I don't think those are the most efficient ways of solving the problem. And we want to do the most good for the climate at the least cost to the economy, to consumers. That's something I think a lot of climate advocates miss. They tend to advocate a kind of deprivation, or they don't pay enough attention to how certain policies might make prices go up for ordinary people. I think that's a real issue. Would a carbon tax fix that? Again, it's a controversial proposal that I think we all need to look at, but we should be considering that and other approaches to letting markets do the work of coming up with the best technologies.
Yeah, when I was reading through an article that where you guys mentioned the carbon tax, considering the typical inefficiency of governments, it really made me wonder how that squares with your belief in small government, let's say. Yeah.
Well, I mean, a carbon tax would be a huge government, intervention in how our economy works. So that's if from a conservative or libertarian point of view, that's an argument against it. On the other hand, if you assume that our government's going to be trying to solve these problems one way or another, it might be the lowest impact way of trying to solve the problem, the one that ultimately produces the greatest benefit with the least cost and disruption.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you touched on an interesting point in that previous explanation of how really in some ways the cost of energy and the cost of moving towards some of these new technologies has a really disproportionate effect on the poor. So explain a little bit about how that ends up affecting those people a lot more.
Well, something you see on what I would call the climate left, or in the progressive movement, is a deep-seated idea that a lot of the problems we're having with carbon emissions are kind of the fault of modern civilization. We're just too rich. We consume too much. We drive too much. Everything is overkill, and there's something almost sinful about that. And what we really need to do is to shrink our economy, to stop economic growth. There's a field that they actually call this policy degrowth, negative growth of the economy. In order to reduce emissions, degrowth is sometimes known by economists as poverty, going backwards. And as you say, it's easy for people who, are college professors or have comfortable jobs involving, where they sit at a laptop all day, to advocate this kind of thing. But the costs fall on the poor and the working class. And the costs, sometimes these policies are global. They fall on some of the poorest people in the world who don't even have access to any sort of energy right now. So I'm very skeptical of those policies, and I think that we need to instead be looking to how can we promote abundance. We need more energy, but we need clean energy. And there are ways that we can get that don't hurt the economy. So I'm very suspicious of policies that start with an almost almost a moral point of view that there's something wrong with our society that has to be fixed through deprivation, through atonement for our sins, because they're assuming that every unit of GDP, every bit that our economy grows, that our emissions are going to grow by the same amount. But that's not true anymore. In fact, we've decoupled our economy to a large extent, our economic activity, from our carbon output and other kinds of pollution. We can grow our economy without growing our emissions. And if we convert to zero carbon energy sources where we can bring down our emissions while still increasing the amount of energy that we have to work with and to use, because a lot of the things that we want to do take energy. A lot of the things we need to do to reduce pollution take energy. It takes energy to run even something as basic as a water treatment plant. You can't run that on, on moonbeams. So we want to treat the water. We don't want raw sewage flowing into our rivers. And there are a lot of other areas in which the solutions to our problems involve not abandoning technology and progress, but more and better technology.
Mm-hmm. So let's say on the other side of the carbon tax issue, a lot of the green energy sources get a lot of government subsidies. So how do let's say, comparing the different energy sources, how much subsidies do each of them need to actually be successful in today's day and age?
Well, I'm a market advocate, so I would like to see, few to no subsidies in the market. And I think a lot of the harm that's been done to our power grid actually comes from excess subsidies. The energy analyst Robert Bryce did an analysis a while back, and he found that if you measure the subsidies of wind and solar per the amount of power they produce, and you compare it to the subsidies for nuclear power, I believe the wind was something like 150 times more per kilowatt hour, and solar was subsidized something like 250 times more per kilowatt hour. That's changing. Actually, Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act has kind of leveled the playing field. Now both nuclear and wind and solar are getting similar subsidies. I think those subsidies could be dramatically reduced across the board, and the market could do the job that we're trying to do with subsidies. But at least they've recognized that this kind of huge, massive disadvantage to nuclear power is bad for our emissions. It slows down progress. It leads to nuclear plants being closed unnecessarily. And when, in fact, if you're really serious about climate, you want to keep every nuclear plant open. You want to build new ones. And then if you want to add wind and solar to the grid, you add that on top of this reliable energy supply. You don't rob Peter to pay Paul by shutting down one type of zero carbon power while you're promising someday in the future to build a different one.
Mm-hmm. So as you're talking about, in some ways, let's say the Inflation Reduction Act almost changing its attitude towards nuclear power, is California actually maybe a good example of a state that is reversing course and changing its outlook towards nuclear?
Yeah, finally. California has had a very strong, as you can imagine, strong environmental movement, but that also included a strong anti-nuclear bias. And they've only got one nuclear plant left in the state. Diablo Canyon has 2 reactors, and it produces, I think, about 9% of the electricity in the state, and a huge percentage of the zero carbon power. Now, California also has one of the country's most ambitious climate plans. They've issued edicts about not allowing the sale of gasoline-powered cars in a decade or so. They've promised to make their power grid completely carbon-free in the relatively near future. A lot of these kind of edicts about where they plan to go, but their attempt to convert their power grid to largely running on wind and solar is just not going well. The grid's less reliable. They're more prone to blackouts. They're importing a lot of energy from other states, including states that make their power from coal. And so they've been kind of running a big experiment, and we can learn from that experiment that this idea that you can seamlessly convert to wind and solar, it turns out to be not anywhere near as easy as people think. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, they've had kind of a road to Damascus conversion on nuclear power. And now the governor, Gavin Newsom, recently signed a measure for the state to issue a loan to help keep Diablo Canyon, their last nuclear power plant, operating. It was scheduled to shut down. Everybody thought it was a great idea to shut it down. And they finally woke up to the idea that they're going to have a massive increase in carbon emissions if they shut that plant down, a huge a spike in their already high electricity rates. So they've seen some sense, and that's really a good thing. And I think we're seeing that kind of awakening in a lot of different areas. It used to be just a common belief that Republicans tended to favor nuclear power, and Democrats and liberals tend to be against nuclear power, and and around the world that's been a standard. The people on the left were suspicious of nuclear power. That's all changing now as people realize the kind of energy crunch that we're in, and the costs of eliminating good sources of power from your power grid. So fortunately, I think we're coming to a more even-handed, sensible approach, and not a moment too soon.
Well, and as a counterexample to that, one that's close to you, the Indian Point Energy Center has just been shut down. So was this ahead of its service life? And I know you've done some work around trying to understand how to bring some of these plants back online and what that would actually entail to really be able to bring them back as part of a carbon neutral energy source.
Right. So I live near the Indian Point power plant, which was always controversial because it's only about 35 miles from New York City. And some people thought that was too risky. Some of the state's environmental groups, including one called Riverkeeper that is associated with protecting the Hudson River, have fought against Indian Point for probably 20 years or more. And our former governor, Andrew Cuomo, he was very opposed to Indian Point even before he became governor. And as governor, he, working together with these environmental groups, they engineered a plan to force the plant's owner to shut it down. And that plan went into effect. Usually when nuclear plants get shut down, the decision gets made 2 or 3 years before the reactor finally gets turned off. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And so often it's a long-term plan. It's possible that if we were looking at this today, that our officials would be less likely to want to turn off Indian Point. But of course, now it's too late. When this plan went into effect, everyone assured us, the environmental groups, Cuomo himself, everyone promised that wind and solar would easily take up the slack for removing this plant. Now, and this is a big plant. This plant produced about 25% of the electricity used in the New York metro area. I mean, it was an enormous part of our downstate power grid. But when it shut down, wind and solar was nowhere near ready to take up the slack. In fact, all the wind and solar production in the state didn't even equal the output from this one plant. Instead, 2 new natural gas-fired power plants had just come online. They took up the slack from Indian Point. So we're burning more natural gas. We're emitting more carbon. Our carbon emissions statewide have gone up 15%. And our prices have gone up dramatically, and our grid is now less reliable. There are worries about blackouts, especially in this coming winter. We're facing more risk of the kind of breakdowns they saw in Texas in 2021 when they had that terrible cold snap. So all together, it was just a terrible idea to shut down this plant. And I visited it a couple of months ago as part of a research project I did for the Manhattan Institute. Could we reopen it, or could other recently closed plants be reopened? And and it was interesting to see the plant as it's being decommissioned, and to talk to the people there about what would be involved in reopening a plant like this.
So let's dig into that a little bit. Like, is there significant cost associated with putting it back into working order? What are some of the considerations there, considering most of the infrastructure and the big bulk of the work is already done?
Yeah, you would think it would be pretty straightforward, right? You've got a plant that's been shut down for a year or something like that, and you get in and you refurbish the equipment and you reload the fuel and you test everything, make sure it's safe, and then you turn it back on. But in fact, it's really not so simple. First, there's the technical requirements, and in the case of Indian Point, the decommissioning is moving along quite promptly. We often have heard over the years, oh my gosh, decommissioning nuclear power plants is almost impossible. It takes decades and decades and costs ridiculous amounts of money. That was an argument against nuclear power that I actually bought into. But today, decommissioning is a pretty organized process. The plants set aside a fund while they're in operation, so it's all paid for. And the company Holtec that is taken over Indian Point and is managing the decommissioning, they on a plant like this, they're able to move relatively rapidly. And what that means is they've already cut large access ports into those containment domes, those the classic look of a nuclear plant. Those domes are super thick reinforced concrete. Once you cut into them, you really can't operate that plant again unless there was some way to repair that big hole, which would be quite difficult. Mm-hmm. And they've started cutting up some of the equipment that is associated, if you think of it as plumbing, essentially, that is associated with making power. Rebuilding all of that and fixing all of that is, at this stage, it's just too late. Anything's possible, but it would be such a massive project. So there's the technical challenge, but there's also a regulatory challenge. Nuclear plants are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's probably our most highly regulated industry in this country. At every step of the way, the NRC is watching, as plants are being built, as they're operated, and as they're being decommissioned. If you wanted to bring a plant back, even when, let's say you hadn't touched anything, you hadn't cut a single pipe, mm-hmm. It would still be a long process to get the NRC to re-examine and then recertify that plant and give the operator back its operating license. When they close a plant, they surrender the operating license, and they have to go through a process of some length to get it back. No one's ever tried to do this. We don't know how long it would take. I talked to the NRC. They don't know how long it would take. They have no set procedure for how a plant might go through the process of applying to have a license reinstated or a new operating license issued. So this is this massive uncertainty. If you're running a business and you might have to invest, $1 billion in refurbishing a plant, if you don't know whether getting a new license is going to take 6 months or 6 years, that is a massive disincentive to taking that gamble and making that investment. So mm-hmm. we need more clarity from the NRC on what would really be involved if a major plant were to attempt to reopen. Sadly, it's too late for Indian Point, but there's mm-hmm. at least one other plant in the country that might be, feasible to look at actually reopening and putting it back online.
So, as we see this real shift towards, let's say, carbon neutral energy, where can we look to as an example of a modern industrialized country that actually dropped their carbon emissions in the recent past?
The most famous example is France. France in the 1980s, they were very concerned, and late 70s, they were very concerned about the global energy crunch. They didn't feel they had a lot of domestic sources of energy, and they made a national decision to invest heavily in nuclear power, and they built a couple of dozen nuclear power plants. And today, their economy runs, their power grid runs on about 70% nuclear power. So that's a good story. It's a good story in how quickly it can be. In about 10 years, they eliminated most of their carbon emissions from their power grid electricity production, and their consumers pay a lower price for electricity than most of the rest of Europe. So that's all good. But even in France, the anti-nuclear sentiment has kind of infected their policy a little bit. So until very recently, the government had a plan to start shutting down nuclear plants, start building more wind and solar, start transitioning from nuclear to wind and solar. And as part of that, they didn't do all the maintenance they should have done on plants. They didn't upgrade plants. And over this past summer, there was a big drought in Europe. A lot of these plants are on rivers and use river water for cooling, as Indian Point did. And some of those rivers got so low that they had to turn down or turn off some of their plants. Other plants had maintenance issues and had to be shut down for updates and repairs. So even France is not as as much of a role model as it could have been. Fortunately, now they are turning around, recognizing that what a treasure they have for their economy in these nuclear plants, and have a plan to keep them going and to build some new ones.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, Jim, wind and solar are here to stay. How do you see them fitting into a grid to help provide some of the energy that we so need?
There's an energy analyst named Meredith Angwin who has this great book called Shorting the Grid. And it's a real wake-up call about how less secure our grid is than it should be. And how a whole lot of our country could be vulnerable to the kind of breakdown we saw in Texas a couple of years ago. So that's something I really recommend to people. She talks about what she calls the could grid versus the real grid that we have. She says, when you read about energy, almost everything you read about, all the articles, all the excitement is about the could grid, the grid we might have, we could build for some time in the future, that's all powered by wind and solar, and it's a smart grid, and things turn on and off depending on how much wind and how much solar, and everybody's got solar panels on their roof. All of that is very exciting, but none of that is really a reality today. We don't have a smart grid. We don't have battery backup to keep the grid going for days or weeks if the wind fails or it's cloudy for a week or two. All of that is kind of hypothetical. And she's an advocate, and I agree that we should be pragmatic about what we have and make sure we protect our good energy sources today before we start assuming that we can do things like shutting down nuclear plants before we've even engineered their replacements. So as you say, wind and solar aren't going away. The prices on wind and solar power production have come down dramatically. I think they have a place in the grid. But because of their intermittency, they are actually really hard to integrate into even a modern power grid. And we don't have the kind of battery backup people imagine, and we won't for many years to come. Battery prices are coming down, but it's not like a computer chip. They're not going to come down at that rate. A lot of the limitations on the energy a battery can hold, they're just chemistry, and there's only so much energy you can put in a battery, and the materials to make these batteries need mining and refining. The whole process takes a lot of energy. And so this fantasy of a wind solar power grid that's with massive battery backup, I think, is something that isn't practical and will take many decades to roll out everything's doable if you spend enough money and enough time. But the question for me is, what's the most efficient, fastest way to have a reliable grid that gives us affordable energy with the least amount of carbon? And I think wind and solar are only a part of that. Nuclear has to be a much bigger part of that. And we also should remember that natural gas, which we have abundantly in this country, is an incredibly useful source of electric power. Yes, it emits carbon, but way less than the coal plants that we used to rely on so much. So to the extent we replace coal with gas, we're making good progress in reducing emissions, and we're keeping our grid reliable at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Looking to the future here, obviously battery technology will get better and really needs to, if we want wind and solar to be part of that power generation. But what are some of the other technologies that will be key for the future of energy generation? Or are SMRs going to play a big role? Is fusion energy looking reasonable on the horizon? What are some of the things that excite you most about future nuclear related power generation?
Yes, I did an article on this for City Journal, I guess it's 2 years ago now. And at that time, I was looking at things like SMR, small modular reactors, and other small factory-built nuclear reactors that are being proposed, what they call advanced reactors, as well as the perhaps farther off promise of fusion power. At that time, the attitude was, well, these are promising, but these are real long shots, and let's wait and see what happens. Today, there are projects in the works right now to build SMRs and other type of advanced reactors at a number of locations around the country. The Department of Energy is putting a lot of money into helping this industry get on its feet in the sense of grants for research and deployment and test case implementation of some of these plants. There's a company called NewScale is building an SMR plant in Idaho. A company called TerraPower is building a plant at an old coal plant in Wyoming, and a couple of others around the country. So I think this technology is really promising. We'll get to fusion in a minute because that's farther off. But the U.S. has funded a lot of cool research in nuclear power going back to the 1950s, but we haven't done much with it. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, we built a bunch of big conventional nuclear power plants, what we call light water plants. It just means that they just use water to run through the reactor to keep it cool. But there's all these other technologies that are well tested, well developed. They were just never deployed commercially. Now there's these new companies that are looking to deploy some of these technologies, like reactors that run using molten sodium salt as a coolant. Others that use high temperature gas. They sound very exotic, but these technologies have been around since the 60s. Mm-hmm. And many of these plants would be quite small. So you build it in a factory instead of trying to construct it on site the way they've traditionally done with big plants. You deliver it on a few flatbed trucks. You could set up a very small plant that could power, instead of 2,000 megawatts like Indian Point, enough to power a quarter of a major city. It might be something that would just power maybe one large chemical plant or refinery, or in some cases they're so small you could use them to power remote villages up in Alaska. And so there are also plans to make these modular smaller reactors that you might install at a power plant that's closed down, say a nuclear plant that's closed down or a coal plant. But instead of having one giant reactor, you might have 10 little ones, and you add them as you need them. That all makes it quicker to build because they're built in a factory, not on site, and much safer because they are much smaller. And all of these power plants are designed so that if something goes wrong, if the coolant gets interrupted, if there's a power failure, they just shut down on their own. They don't need pumps and water pumped through them to stay cool. The operators could literally just walk away or fall asleep or whatever, and the reactor would be fine. The community would be fine. This is the kind of technology I think that could help reassure people that it's okay to have a nuclear plant, not too far from where you live. And I think they could do a lot to make our power grid more dependable. Mm-hmm. Now, you asked about fusion. Fusion,
real quick,
go ahead.
Just before we move on to fusion, Jim, you picked up on a point there that is really important to understand. Is a big part of the cost for building nuclear plants is the custom designed, built on site idea of how these plants are built. So building them to a set standard and building them somewhat modularly is a huge advantage in reducing the actual cost that goes into building these plants, right?
Absolutely. The idea of constructing large traditional nuclear power plants has pretty much ground to a halt in this country. The last two are just being finished, or one is finished in Georgia. They ran wildly over budget. But some of the reason that these constructions ran so over budget was also the intensity of the NRC's regulation, I think, to an excessive level in some cases. The NRC had a habit, or has had a habit, of changing the rules on companies mid-project, saying, oh, no, now you need to redesign this component and that component. Mm-hmm. And they'd have to go back to the drawing board, sometimes for years, before they'd be allowed to move forward. This is a very, very expensive way to build anything. Of course, we want nuclear power to be carefully regulated. It has to be completely safe. But there have been a lot of unnecessary roadblocks put in front of nuclear power. We're still not clear that the NRC is going to issue the approvals and allow this next generation of even safer nuclear power to get going. They have approved a couple of these plants. Took them longer than it should have, but we do seem to be moving forward. But I'm an advocate for reform at the NRC. They really need to adapt their procedures for this next generation of nuclear power. These plants are very different from, building 1,000 megawatt reactor on site. And the NRC needs to streamline its processes to fit this new technology. I heard somebody at a conference the other day saying, it's you imagine you have a regulatory system to regulate giant diesel trucks, and then you try to use the same checklist in order to approve a motorbike, and it's just it's just not appropriate, and I think they really need to change. Hopefully they will, and so I do think this next wave of nuclear power will be important. It's going to take time to roll it out, though. So at the same time that we're encouraging that, we need to do what we can to make sure our existing nuclear power plants are kept in good shape and kept running as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. So do we have any prospect of fusion for the near-ish horizon? I know I've been watching some stuff recently. There are plants under construction. They've only been able to sustain fusion for a couple seconds at a time. So where are we with that? And do you think that really holds the key to the future?
Yeah. So, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and one of the pioneering fusion research projects, Forrestal, was, not too far from where I grew up. And the joke then was that fusion power would happen 20 years in the future. And every 20 years, it's still 20 years in the future. Mm-hmm. You'll see that joke in every single article ever written about fusion power. We might be getting closer now. And one sign that we're getting closer is that a lot of private investors, including people like Bill Gates, are putting money into a whole bunch of different startups that are experimenting with different approaches to creating and sustaining the fusion reaction. So for everybody who slept through their high school physics class, our conventional reactors use nuclear fission. That's the splitting of atoms, like uranium atoms, which releases a large amount of energy. Fusion is the process of jamming together atoms, typically some kind of hydrogen, and in the process of fusing, those atoms release orders of magnitude more energy, and in a process that also doesn't involve any kind of radioactive risk. So a fusion reaction, in theory, is essentially harnessing the process that makes the energy in the sun and using easily available source materials. This could be it would just be a global revolution. If we really harnessed fusion power in a practical way, it would be a global revolution in energy, theoretically almost unlimited energy, and made with no environmental impact. So that's the dream. I think we are getting closer, but I think it'd be foolhardy to gamble that this will be our future energy system. I think we need to keep working on other more near-term approaches. There's been a little bit of progress. There's a giant in Europe. There's a giant fusion test bed, and they're making some progress in getting fusion reactions started and sustaining them. But we're talking like milliseconds here. Mm-hmm. So it's the idea that we could have a fusion reactor that would just keep humming along for week after week, it's still a ways off if it does happen. But a lot of people who used to think it was a pipe dream are now taking it much more seriously. So fingers crossed on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully we can see more progress on that front. Jim, maybe before we wrap up, one other thing I wanted to touch on with you is the idea of carbon capture. So really, should it be split into two different ways to think about it? One would be sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, and the other one would be capturing carbon as we emit it, right?
Yeah. There are two stages of the process. So yeah, carbon capture and storage, CCS, has been something that people have been working on for a long time. And there's a lot of controversy surrounding it. I think it's really worth the research. So there's a couple of ways you could do it. You could take a coal-fired power plant and then take the emissions, the smoke from burning the coal, process it through a way where you run it through a solution that strips a lot of the carbon out. And then you take that CO2 and run it through a pipe to some place where you could store it underground. And typically this means just the way that we get natural gas out of the ground from a well hole, you can also pump things down into the ground. And it's hard to believe this, but they actually will stay there. So in theory, you could take the carbon and pump it down. I think stripping CO2 out of the exhaust from a coal-fired power plant is not the way to go. It's really expensive, takes a lot of energy, hasn't worked that well. It might work someday. It hasn't worked that well. But there are other approaches to carbon capture. One very simple thing is if you look at natural gas, it's methane, and it's a combination of hydrogen and carbon. And if you can take the carbon out. So when you burn it, the carbon's not combining with oxygen to form CO2. You're just burning the hydrogen. That would be an extraordinary way to harness this great resource we have in the abundant natural gas we have, but without releasing CO2. There are a bunch of projects working on that. I think that's got some promise. So, and those are a couple of there are other approaches as well, but I think that that sequestering carbon is worth considering. And then finally, there are some systems. A friend of mine is a geologist who works at Columbia University. He's been working on an approach where you use the natural processes of some rocks. Some rocks are very, they want to bond with the CO2 in the atmosphere. They will literally form new rock out of the carbon in the atmosphere, a little bit like the way stalactites and stalagmites will form in a cave. You can harness that process to take CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. There's other people with different approaches, and would that be worth doing someday? Obviously it would be expensive. You need to find some way to make it profitable. But we are seeing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere climbing pretty dramatically. And sadly, it's not our fault so much. It's mostly China now whose our rates of emitting CO2 are going down as our economy decouples from emissions. But we might find ourselves in a situation somewhere in the future where it's worth considering this, what's called direct air capture. In addition to reducing the amount we emit, we could probably, somewhat cost effectively suck a fair amount of CO2 right out of the air, whether it's using this technique with rocks, crushed gravel, or other approaches. I'm a fan. I think right now it is worth exploring a lot of these approaches. We need to be wary of doubling down, of letting politicians drive the decisions about where we finally commit ourselves. I'd like to see a lot of different approaches working, just like we're seeing with the small modular reactors. There's a bunch of different companies exploring this. That's good. We don't want to just say, okay, we picked the company, we're giving them billions of dollars, this is what we're doing. I'd rather see a system where the government funds research and early development, but then we let the market work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really aligning incentives and let the market do what it needs to do, I think is key to that. Jim, I want to thank you for an excellent, wide-ranging conversation this morning. Of course, you're available on Twitter at James B. Meigs, as well as the show at Fix It Show. And a good list of your articles are available under your link at manhattan-institute.org. Anywhere else you want to point people to, James?
That's good. That'll cover most of my work. I also write a column for Commentary Magazine, but it's but there's a lot going on in this energy space, and with all this sort of sense of catastrophism out there, I think it's actually should be a time for real optimism, because there's a lot of exciting work going on, and it's fun for me to be able to cover it.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show and helping us uncover some of the mystery and maybe make us a bit more positive on the outlook on energy.
Happy to do it.
Thanks, Jim.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.